If you're funding your company with convertible notes, pre-money safes, and or post-money safes, it's very important to understand the impact they're going to have on your dilution, or you can get a nasty surprise. We'll talk about a spreadsheet today that lets you analyze a combination of convertible notes, pre-money safes, and post-money safes in your funding rounds, so you can see exactly what the impact could be on your dilution. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. The spreadsheet we'll talk about today can be used to analyze up to 10 pre-money safes and or convertible notes combined with up to 10 post-money safes. Now that'll handle quite a few different scenarios for funding your startup. And as with the previous videos in the sequence, there's a link in the notes where you can download the spreadsheet. Now this particular spreadsheet did involve quite a few hours of work, and it incorporates quite a few capabilities into it. So this time it's not a free download. There is a small fee involved in downloading it. However, we'll go through in the video everything you need to know to create your own if you'd rather roll it yourself. But you will save some time if you use the download spreadsheet. Now, with that, let's jump into the scenarios the spreadsheet covers. So there are two scenarios covered in the spreadsheet that give you a founder-friendly version and a more investor-friendly version, so you can understand the range of possibilities in your funding. The first one is the more founder-friendly one. This bases the share price on a fully diluted capitalization that includes the founder stock, any pre-existing options that have been committed, and any pre-existing options that have been allocated but not committed, plus any additional options that have been required by the Series A investor. By the way, we'll refer to the Series A as simply being the priced round that's going to convert all these convertible securities into stock. So this particular scenario is friendly to the entrepreneur in that, on the one hand, the investors are requiring the allocation of some options up front that does dilute the founders, and it's extremely common. But from there on, that sets the price, and all of the convertible notes that convert then are diluting both the founders and the option pool and the Series A investors. So as opposed to pushing all of the dilution on the founders, the dilution is more shared. The second scenario is more favorable to the Series A investors. In this scenario, the share price is set to the right price such that at the end of the entire round, after all the notes have converted, the Series A investors are getting a specific percentage of the company. And that means the price is pushed down to the point where they get enough stock to maintain their percentage, even though all those convertible securities are converting. So that effectively pushes the dilution onto the founders. And by going through that scenario compared with scenario one, you'll be able to see what the real difference is from the founder point of view as an impact on the dilution. Now, the numbers we'll use in the spreadsheet specifically for scenario number 2 follow the example in Y Combinator's Quick Start Guide for Safes. If you look on page 23 under the example combination of pre-money and post-money safes, we're using those numbers. Now you can download the Quick Start Guide with a link in the notes and follow along to see how the spreadsheet numbers match the numbers in the Y Combinator example. So let's walk through the spreadsheet. Starting at the top, we begin just by documenting the existing cap table, capitalization table, in other words, the existing stock situation the founders have before doing any funding. How many shares do the founders have? In this example here, we have 9,250,000. Now I should note here that number's in green. The green numbers in the spreadsheet are the numbers that you can fill in with your particular example. The black text, of course, is descriptive. The black numbers are numbers generated by formulas. So don't change the formulas unless you really understand the spreadsheet and are ready to make some tweaks. Okay, so we've got 9.25 million shares of stock with the founders. They've issued some options that are committed, 650,000 shares, and they've allocated some uncommitted options, some options that, again, are allocated but not committed to anybody. We want to track those just in case they exist, because when the investor requires a total unallocated option pool to be issued, that can include these options that are already there and are unallocated. So you don't have to issue quite as many new option shares or allocate as many new option shares if you already have some allocated. Now, you might not have any options at all, in which case your committed options and uncommitted options will just be zero. Maybe all you have is founder stock. That's fine. Just plug in the appropriate numbers. Next, we document the convertible notes and the pre-money safes. Now, you can see here in the spreadsheet, there's room for a total of 10 of those. I've just filled in one since the Y Combinator example had one pre-money safe. So you can see here, it's a $200,000 investment, a $3.8 million pre-money cap. There's no discount, so that's zero, and there's no pro rata. Now, it's a little unusual to have a pro rata right with a pre-money safe or a convertible note, but it can happen, in which case the investor has the right to take whatever percent ownership they received from sort of the conversion of all the convertible securities and then buy into the Series A to maintain that percentage. Again, more common with a post-money safe than it is with a pre-money or with a convertible note, but it can happen. And then we also now have an annual interest rate and a number of months to conversion. Now, that is there because these may be notes. If they're pre-money safes, the interest is zero. If they're notes, they'll have an interest rate, and this is where you can plug that in. Now, the reason the number of months to conversion is there is that to analyze the impact, the dilution impact of all of this funding, you have to make an assumption about what the priced round looks like that's going to convert these securities. That means you have to have an idea of what the timing is of it, because you'll need to add the interest rate for any convertible notes that you have in the round. So you're making an assumption about when in the future you're going to convert the securities because of a priced round, and you plug in the number of months in that column so that that can be applied to the interest rate and added to that, in this case, $200,000 amount. Now, in this case, it's a pre-money safe, so the interest is zero and life is simple. Next, we document the post-money safes. Again, there's room for up to 10 of those. So in this case, you can see it's an $800,000 investment with an $8 million post-money cap. That means that in the safe round, the investor is being promised at least 10% of the company. In this example, no discount, and there is a pro rata right. So in other words, this investor is given the right to buy up to 10% of the Series A round in order to try to maintain the percent ownership that they get from the safe round. All right, so that documents all of the inputs prior to the Series A investment. Now let's take a look at the terms of the actual investment round that's going to convert these securities. Again, sticking with the Y Combinator example, it's a $15 million pre-money valuation, a $5 million investment, and a requirement that the company allocate a total of 10% of the company's fully diluted shares to a stock option pool that's uncommitted. In the case of scenario 2, there's going to be a requirement that 10% is maintained at the end of the deal. When it's all done, everything's converted, 10% of the stock is actually in the option pool. And also, if you look at this deal, it's 15 money pre, 5 million investment, so it's a $20 million post-money valuation. With a 5 million investment on a 20 million post, the Series A investors are expecting to own 25% of the company. Now, in scenario A, we're going to convert their investment along with all the converting securities in terms of the safes and the convertible notes, and they're going to get diluted. But scenario B says they're going to maintain that 25%. So they're going to get enough stock that even with all those securities converting, they still have that 25% ownership at the end of the round. So let's talk first about scenario 1 and figure out what the share price is for the Series A investors. We need to do that first because the share price will determine how some of the safes convert. Again, you could get into a scenario where the discount price is so low that it's a better deal than converting using either the pre-money or the post-money cap. For scenario 1, again, we have 9.25 million plus the options. That's a total of 9.9 million committed shares and 100,000 uncommitted. So the required additional options to result in the options being 10% of the totally diluted amount of stock is 1 million. So that gives you a total of 11 million shares of stock that's committed. Now, 10% of that is 1,100,000, and that's exactly the number of shares in the uncommitted stock pool. The 1 million additional shares that got allocated plus the 100,000 that were already allocated. So our math works so far. Determining the Series A price is easy enough. We simply take the pre-money valuation of 15 million, divide that 11 million total number of diluted, fully diluted shares into that, and you get just over $1.36 per share. Now, dividing that into the $5 million investment amount for the Series A gives you the total number of Series A shares, just over 3.6 million shares. Now that we've determined that, we can go back and take a look at the SAFE round, see what happens to all those SAFE dollars. Well, first the pre-money SAFE, and we take a look at the SAFE price, in other words, the price determined by the cap, compare that to the discount price. Well, the discount here is 0, so you're really comparing it to the Series A price. Now, in this case, obviously, the SAFE price is much more attractive, so the SAFE investors will opt for that lower price. And you can see the number of shares that yields for them is just over 578,000 shares. Now, there is no pro rata for the pre-money SAFE, so that amount is 0. So the total in the end round is going to be that $578,000 number. Now on to analyzing the post-money SAFEs. Again, there's only one, could be up to 10, but only one in the example. So first you look at the number of shares that the SAFE, post-money SAFE investors would receive, assuming the SAFE price, in other words, the price implied by their post-money cap. Compare that to the discount price. In this case, the discount's 0, so it's just the Series A share price. And clearly, they're going to get a better deal with the SAFE price, so that's what they'll go with. Now, in this case, there's also a pro rata right for this investor, so there's a particular number of shares also allocated for that pro rata right. So here's what the cap table looks like at the end of the SAFE round, where we're treating the SAFE round really as its own round of investment prior to the Series A. But again, to figure out how that round looked, we did have to figure out the pricing on the Series A first. So we've got the number of shares the founders had, plus the stock they'd already committed, plus the uncommitted options gives us our 11 million totally diluted number of shares. And then we calculated just over 578,000 shares for the pre-money SAFEs, and not taking the pro rata right into account, because that comes later in the Series A. The amount allocated for the post-money shares in the SAFE round is just over 1.2 million. So that gives us about 12.8 million total number of shares in this round. And of course, not surprisingly, the post-money SAFE shares own 10% of that particular round. That was the commitment for their 800,000 investment on an $8 million post-money valuation. So now getting into the Series A, as you recall, our share price is just over $1.36. There are just over 3.6 million Series A shares, but we calculated up above the pro rata right that the one post-money SAFE investor has. So that has to be subtracted from those Series A shares to get the number of shares that are actually available for new investors. And having allocated that, now we can take a look at the cap table. The first few numbers, same as from the SAFE round, and we get down now to the post-money SAFE being a bigger number because now it includes their pro rata share. And then you've got the Series A investor shares at 3.3 million, so for a total capitalization of just over 16.5 million shares. Now, one thing to note, you'll see that the post-money SAFEs actually are at 10% ownership, 10% of the round at the end of the Series A. Now, that is true because in this case, What we did was we had the post-money safes convert after the price was set that incorporated the additional options that the Series A investors were requiring. So in other words, the post-money safe investors really did get the same deal that the Series A investors got. They didn't invest until after those diluting options were issued, and that diluted the founders, but not the post-money safe investors. That'll be different in the next round when we look at scenario 2, where we're going to force the post-money safes to get their early investment diluted, and they'll still have the option of buying into 10% of the Series A round, but since their earlier investment in the safe round got diluted by the options, they're going to end up with less than a 10% ownership after the Series A is completed. Keep in mind, this is all a negotiation. It's possible that the post-money safe investors could convince the Series A investors that no, their shares should convert after the imposition of those options, just like in this scenario 1. It's all a negotiation, and it's one of the things that absolutely can have an effect on the dilution impact of the convertible notes and safes and the priced round. At the end of the round, in this case, the founders own 55.95% of the company. That's the number to keep in mind now as we go through scenario number 2. So in scenario 2, we want 10% of the fully diluted shares of the company to be allocated to an uncommitted option pool at the end of the round, after all the stock's been issued to the convertible notes, the safes, and the Series A investors. And we want the Series A investors to get enough stock so that they own 25% of the company at the end of the round, even though all those other convertible securities are also being converted. The trick here is similar to earlier spreadsheets we've looked at. This is a little complicated to figure out because the price of the Series A round is going to depend on the fully diluted number of shares. There's this relationship because depending on the price, that determines how the safes and or convertible notes will convert. What kicks in, the safe price or the discount price? That changes everything. Well, and when you change the total number of diluted shares, that changes the price. So it's circular. Bottom line is you need to iterate the formula to zero in on the right answer. In a previous spreadsheet, which had just post-money safes in it, we iterated the price. This time, we're going to iterate the number of shares because when you have both pre-money safes and post-money safes and convertible notes, it's pretty much what you have to do to get to the right optimal answer that gives 25% ownership to the Series A investors. What you get to do in this spreadsheet is tweak that green number that says enter your estimate of the end of round fully diluted number of shares and iterate until the calculated Series A ownership just below that number is equal to the target Series A ownership. The target in this case is 25%. There's a calculation just above the green number that says the number of fully diluted shares will likely be less than that number. That's sort of the pessimistic big number of shares. And sure enough, if you plug in different numbers in that green field, you'll find that 17.993 million shares is the right number that gets you to a 25% ownership of the Series A investment. So that's the way you come up with the right answer, is iterating through that number to nail, in this case, 25%. We've iterated that. We've come up with the fully diluted stock number that we have to hit. And then it's easy to come up with the size of the option pool. It's just 10% of that number. And it's easy to come up with the Series A shares now because we know what percent of that number they get. So that's simple math. And then we can determine the price because you know how much money they're investing, you know how many shares they're getting, a little bit of math, and you've got the Series A price. Now we can actually analyze our safe round. First of all, we'll look at the pre-money safes and look at what the safe price would be versus what the discount price would be. And again, the discount in this example is 0, so it's not just the discount price, it's actually the Series A price. And clearly, The SAFE price, again, is a much better deal, so that's going to drive the number of shares for the pre-money SAFEs. And again, it's no pro rata right, so the only shares they'll get are the shares driven by the SAFE price. And on to the post-money SAFE. Similar calculation, looking at the SAFE price determined by the post-money valuation compared to what is in fact the Series A price. Again, not surprisingly, the SAFE price is going to be a better deal. And so that's the number that'll be used. And in this case, there is a pro rata right. And so we're going to have additional shares in the final Series A round. That doesn't affect the SAFE round. The SAFE round is before the pro rata kicks in, but it'll come back in the final round. And that leads us to the SAFE round cap table. So as you can see, we've got our usual numbers, 9.25 million shares for the founders, the committed option pool, the 100K uncommitted, and we calculated 615,000, just over that number share for the pre-money, and just over 1.179 million shares for the post-money SAFE. And there you have the total number of shares. And of course, the post-money SAFE owns now 10% of that SAFE round. Again, looking at the SAFE round as a round standing alone by itself before the Series A occurs. So now we can take a look at the Series A. Just to repeat some of the numbers we've already figured out, we know how much is allocated for the Series A. We know what's the total number of shares except for the uncommitted option pool. And that's, again, the shares we had originally, plus those issued for the pre-money SAFE, plus those that are going to be committed for the post-money SAFE, including the pro rata. We've got the shares for the uncommitted option pool. We know what the pro rata allocation is, and we know, again, what's then available to the Series A, just that top number of just under 4.5 million minus the pro rata. So we have all the key numbers available for the cap table. And so that gives us the cap table for our Scenario 2 Series A investors. The usual amounts for the founders and stock options, the amount we calculated for the pre-money SAFEs, and the post-money SAFE together with the pro rata share. And then we've got the Series A shares, and finally the total number of actual issued and committed shares. Now let's take into account the additional options that we're being forced to include by the Series A investors, and that's 10%, right, of the final total number. So that's just shy of 1.8 million shares. That is going to result in something less than 10% ownership on the part of the post-SAFE investors. If you add their base number of shares together with their pro rata right, it doesn't quite come up to 10%. And again, the reason is their first investment is being diluted by those shares. So that's bringing down their percent, even though they're buying 10% of the Series A. And if we look back up to the top now, it's a 51.4% ownership number for the founders. Now, one other note, if you're comparing this to the example in Y Combinator's guide, quick start guide to the post-money fast, you'll see a slight difference in numbers here. They have 16.193 million shares outstanding before taking into account the stock options. It's extremely close to within, 4 shares of the numbers we have in our spreadsheet. But then they add in 1.8 million shares instead of what we're adding in, which is, a little over 600 fewer shares. Well, for some reason they rounded it up. Obviously, 1.8 million is not exactly equal to 10% of 17.99 million. That would be 1.7993 million. So for some reason they rounded up the number of shares that are allocated for the option pool. That's why there's round numbers, about a 600 share difference in the total diluted number of shares in the round in the spreadsheet compared to the Y Combinator example. Again, why they rounded, I don't know, but that explains the difference. I do believe actually the calculation in the spreadsheet is correct. And that completes our walkthrough of the spreadsheet. Again, this is a very valuable exercise to do when you have multiple convertible securities, because you really want to know what the dilution impact is. Also, these two scenarios give you kind of the two ends of the spectrum. The better solution for the founders, the better solution for investors. Picking a number somewhere in between, a number of totally diluted shares that's going to pull back, will actually increase the price and reduce the dilution for the founders, is then something that you can negotiate. But the spreadsheet gives you a tool to do that, so you can see the implication for different pricing amounts. And it's better to know when you're going in to negotiate with a Series A investor. It's better to know what the implication is for you and for them than to not know. And this spreadsheet lets you figure that out. So again, there's a link in the notes where you can get the spreadsheet. There is a small fee, but I think we've covered enough in this video that if you want to develop your own spreadsheet, that's certainly doable too. Downloading ours will just save you quite a bit of time. That's it for today. All of the videos in this series on dilution analysis for convertible securities are combined in a playlist. A link to that is right below me, so you can check out the entire series. So if this was helpful, please click like and share it and comment. And if you haven't subscribed, please do that, because we'll certainly have a lot more videos coming up. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.